This is the Digging for Truth podcast, presented by the Associates for Biblical Research, demonstrating the historical reliability of the Bible through archaeological and biblical research.
If you take the time to read the book of Joshua, you'll quickly find that it's full of historical details, names of kings, cities, geographical locations, and battles. To be honest, other than the Battle of Jericho, I'm not super familiar with or can remember what all happened in the book of Joshua, just like maybe most people aren't. So here's a passage that I found kind of interesting. Jabin, king of Hazor, sent word to Jobab of Madon, to the kings of Shimron and Aksheph, and to the northern kings who were in the mountains, in the Arabah, south of Kinnereth, in the western foothills, and in Naphath Dor on the west, to the Canaanites in the east and west, to the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, and Jebusites in the hill country, and to the Hivites below Hermon in the region of Mizpah. They came out with all their troops and a large number of horses and chariots, a huge army, as numerous as the sand on the seashore. All these kings joined forces and made camp together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. The Lord said to Joshua, "Don't be afraid of them, because by this time tomorrow, I'll hand all of them, slain, over to Israel. You're to hamstring their horses and burn their chariots." So Joshua and his whole army came against them suddenly at the waters of Merom and attacked them. And the Lord gave them into the hand of Israel. They defeated them and pursued them all the way to Greater Sidon, to Misrephoth-Maim, and to the valley of Mizpah on the east until no survivors were left. Joshua did to them as the Lord had directed. He hamstrung their horses and burned their chariots. At that time, Joshua turned back and captured Hazor and put its king to the sword. Hazor had been the head of all of these kingdoms. Joshua took all these royal cities and their kings and put them to the sword. He totally destroyed them. Yet Israel didn't burn any of the cities on their mountains, except Hazor, which Joshua burned. Those were some selected verses out of Joshua 11. So Henry, how do you say it? Hazor? Hazor? Does it matter?
Yeah, it looks like razor, doesn't
Okay.
it? Right?
Yeah.
Except with an H, right? Hazor. So a lot of people pronounce it that way. Now in the Hebrew, if you want to be picky about it, it's Hatzor, because the letter there that's translated as a Z is called a tzade, right? So it's Hatzor. So that's how I say it.
Okay.
Because actually it was my first archaeology dig that I ever got any experience on. And so that's how they pronounced it, the guy who ran the dig. His last name is Ben-Tur. But I try not to be too picky about these things, you know. You say Hazor, I say Hatzor, right?
Yeah. But that's cool that this is a dig you were a part of. Did you have a square and then you sifted stuff? How did that work?
Yeah. So it was my first time ever on an archaeology dig. It was 2007.
Okay.
So it was my early days in ABR. And so we weren't digging at the time because our dig at Khirbet el-Maqader had been shut down because of political situation in Israel, and we hadn't restarted it yet. And so we were looking for ways to stay connected to doing digs. So I went on a tour to Israel. It was my first time, you know, so this was very exciting for me. And then I ended my time in Israel by going to Hazor for just a week. So it wasn't too long. They usually don't let people dig for that short of a period of time, but they let me. So I just served as a volunteer, you know, digging in a square, learning how to use the tools properly, what to look for pottery and other finds, getting to know people from around the world. You know, it was really interesting cultural experience for me. And, you know, sort of cut my teeth. I mean, 4 or 5 days of digging isn't enough, but it was enough to be like, hey, this is really exhausting and really a lot of fun. And the site is really important, which is we're going to talk about.
Yeah. And honestly, like, if I didn't know we were talking about it today, I don't know if I've ever heard of it before.
Yeah.
Like, even in the Bible, I'm sure, I know I've read through the book of Joshua before, but was it a significant city? And what can you tell us about a little bit about the background of it as a Canaanite city?
Sure.
And what it was like.
Yeah, it's a good
before the conquest.
Good question. So just to give people a point of reference, you know, most people are familiar, at least, well, obviously with Jericho, right? And then they go to Ai, which is not as well known, but still, like, it's kind of the flow of the narrative. And then in the biblical text, you have other events occur. In Joshua 10, there's a campaign against this coalition of southern kings.
Okay.
And then all of a sudden in 11, you're up in the northern part of Israel, north of the Sea of Galilee, and Joshua attacks the city, Hazor. And so some of the background of it is, it was a very important city. It's a very large city, one of the largest sites in Israel, except for Jerusalem. It's enormous, a couple hundred acres. It was right along the trade route that ran from Egypt up through into Asia.
Okay.
So it was a very important trade site. Like Megiddo is another site that's like that along the coastal plain. Now Hazor is not on the coast, but the trade route runs up through Israel and near there.
So since it was a trade route, it's probably a rich city.
Yeah. I mean, the biblical text refers it to as the head of all those kingdoms.
Okay.
Which is fascinating because we know from Joshua and from other archaeological evidence, the descriptions of the political structure in Canaan at that time is sort of what we call city-states, In Joshua, it says the king of Jericho, the king of Ai, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hazor, and so on. But Hazor was the biggest. So the fact that the biblical text calls it that is an indication to me of more of an eyewitness kind of account, knowing that this was an important city. It predates the biblical references in Joshua by many centuries. It had been there for a long time. Scholars have found, archaeologists have found written texts that refer to Hazor, the city, trade with Hazor, like tin trade, for example. So very, very important site in this period, in the Canaanite era, really going back almost into the third millennium, if my memory serves me correctly. So very early. And maintained its significance over a long period of time.
So if it had been in that amount of prominence, obviously it's mentioned in the Bible, but it must be mentioned in a number of other extra biblical narratives as well. Is that?
Yeah.
What are some of those things?
Yeah. So we have several references. One of them is there's Egyptian texts. They're called execration texts. So they're like curses. So they would write like a curse against somebody like on pottery. And you would smash it and then bury it in the ground. And Hazor is mentioned on one of these, and it's like an invoking of a curse. So the city of Hazor is mentioned in an Egyptian execration text. And also the name has been found, did I mention earlier about tin?
Yes.
Yeah, from the Mari archive. So that's in Syria starting in 1933. There was thousands of tablets discovered there, and they discovered reference to Hazor. So here you have trade taking place between Hazor and Mari, which is another significant site. We probably do a show on that at some point in time. And then later we have the Amarna letters, which we've talked before. I think we've done an episode on that with Dr. Stripling. And so the Amarna letters are a correspondence between kings in Canaan and the Egyptian pharaoh, because the Canaanite states were sort of vassal states of the pharaoh in various ways and different levels of control. But these letters are correspondences between the Canaanite kings, and a couple of the letters have the name of Hazor. They're actually letters from the king of Hazor written to the pharaoh at Amarna. Many of the letters complain about these people running around the land, the Abiru, who are causing all kinds of havoc. We think could be reference to the Israelites, but it mentions the city, and it's from the king himself. And these were found in Egypt. So fascinating discoveries related to it. So there's no question of its prominence and significance in these examples, and that's how the Bible describes them. Describes the city as being important. So you get that sense by its size and by the fact that in multiple locations, Egypt, Syria, Egypt twice, the Amarna letters as well, of its importance.
I was looking some stuff up before we were talking, and there's another one, a Babylonian cuneiform that's even older, that also mentions like a name. And so is it Jabin? That name is mentioned in this tablet, and it's also mentioned in the Bible. What is this Babylonian tablet?
Yeah, so they found it's written in old Babylonian clay tablets. So the date is like from the 18th century. So that's It's
BC, we're talking.
BC, yeah, right? So we're talking 300 and some years probably before the time of Joshua.
Okay.
And it uses this name, Ibni, Yabni, but it sounds very familiar to those familiar with the biblical text because it's the king that's mentioned in Joshua is Jabin. We say that in English, king of Hazor. And then later in Judges, probably 130 years later, something like that, there's also a reference to this name. Now, there's been dispute about the meaning of the name and why is it the same name when they're centuries apart and all that. But generally speaking, it's a really fascinating connection because not only does it mention Hazor, but it mentions the name of the king. Now, probably it's some kind of dynastic title or something like that. You had a lot of Tutmoses, for example, in Egypt. Tutmoses the first, second, third, fourth, Ramses, that kind of thing. So the fact that the name lasts for a long period of time, it shouldn't be surprising to us. The fact that it's in Judges and in Joshua, some people have tried to say, oh, these accounts are sort of conflated together, or the biblical author was confused or mixed up. It didn't have the right king. It's the same name. Not really a problem when you kind of see that this tablet has the name, and this is centuries before Joshua. So it's really, really interesting.
Yeah. So the two main stories that happen in the Bible come from the book of Joshua, and you were just saying the book of Judges. So in Joshua, they were conquering the land. You said this. It was Jericho, first stop, then Ai. Then there was some other stuff, and then they kind of moved to the northern part and then conquered Hazor. So it was the third city that's mentioned that was burned.
Yes.
And so what happened when Joshua did stuff?
Yeah. The three cities that are explicitly mentioned that were burned by fire by Joshua and the Israelite army are Jericho, Ai, and Hazor. Now, maybe they burned other cities that we just don't know about, but the biblical text says that explicitly. So, one of the things you look for in archaeology is a nice fire. If it's a big fire and you find evidence for it, you can correlate it with a written text. But, the king had heard about Joshua's victory over the southern coalition in Joshua 10 and got nervous, so he put together his own coalition.
Okay.
With
these other city-states.
Exactly. Sort of conspired to say, hey, listen, these Abiru, if you want to say it that way, are causing havoc here. They've attacked the southern coalition. They defeated them, all five of the kings, executed them. So they were afraid, that Joshua was going to do the same thing to them. So they got a coalition together. We see in Joshua 11:6 that the Lord tells Joshua not to be afraid and that the armies of Israel would prevail. And then you see how the battle unfolds there in the biblical text. So they defeat the king of Hazor, they defeat the army there, and they set the city on fire. And so they have this great victory that they achieve over that city. And the city is strategically, militarily important in the northern part of Israel. So if you're going to take the northern part of Israel, you got to take Hazor out. You got to supplant the political force there. Otherwise, you can't seize control of the northern part of the country. Much like Jericho in the southern part, where you're entering the country from the east, you're sort of cutting Jerusalem off from the northern part of the country. It's a strategic kind of thing, and the same thing with Hazor.
So everyone is probably familiar with, Jericho had these famously huge walls that protected the city in this, fortified site. Hazor seems, at least the way you've described it, was it bigger than Jericho? Like, I feel like it, just based on what we've been talking about, that it was.
Yeah. The whole city much larger than Jericho. I mean, it's an enormous size. I can't remember off the top of my head how big Jericho is. I want to say 10 to 15 acres, something like that.
Okay.
But Hazor is like 200 acres.
Huh. And was it continuously walled all the way around, or just maybe a small part?
Yeah. The main part of the city, well, it's interesting because like at the top of the city, they call it the Coke bottle, because when you look at it from the sky, the way that the top of the city is shaped, it looks like a bent Coke bottle.
Okay.
And then there's the bottom part of the city. And when you go there, you can see pictures online of how enormous it is. So yes, there were fortifications around the city, but it doesn't look like from the archaeology that the Israelites took the city out in the same way they did Jericho, because there's nothing in the account about the walls falling. So it's a little bit of a different type of situation. It doesn't tell us specifically much about the fortifications.
Just from my own thinking, it's like, well, everybody knows about Jericho, but Hazor seems like it was a bigger deal, like in terms of size and stuff. And it's like we don't know that story as well. Maybe it was less miraculous. I mean, it was still a miracle, but
yes. Well, the Lord, it's more, it seems, I guess the narrative is more what you might call providential in terms of ordinary providence. It looks like on the surface. God promises the Israelites are going to have victory as long as they're obedient, which they are in this case. But it doesn't give you any miraculous account of like the walls coming down.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably what it's about. But in terms of significance, I think to your question, it's actually, I hadn't thought of it quite that way before, Luke, the way that you're asking the question. Really, it's a larger victory.
Yeah. It's
from a military standpoint.
Yeah.
And the size of the city. Yeah.
And one that we don't know much. I don't know much about at all. I know about Jericho, but the other ones,
and everybody knows about Jericho because of the song and all that kind of thing. So it's really fascinating. I think that's a good way to put it. And then the account moves on. That's the thing. Sometimes in the biblical text we have an account, and then the Lord is on to something else that He wants to tell us in the story of Joshua.
And then they went here, and then they went here.
Yeah. It looks like it's a rapid campaign. In some ways the campaign is, but it really takes place over 6 years. So it's not as rapid as the main conquest. Obviously, in the Judges period, they're settling down and trying to take full hold of their territories that are allotted to them by the Lord, right? Those accounts that you read in Joshua that tells you the boundaries and all that, and everybody goes, what is this for? Where are these places and all that? Well, these are territories then they have to sort of continue to get the Canaanites out of, which they are unsuccessful in doing in many cases, and they become corrupted by their religious system. But the conquest, it's interesting when you're reading the text, it looks like you're reading a text, so it looks like it's happening very fast.
Yeah. So the book of Joshua is all about the conquering of the land, basically. But then the next thing that happens is the book of Judges. So they, like you were just saying, they've settled the land, they divided it up among the tribes. But now, instead of Israel doesn't have kings yet, they have judges that are ruling over.
Yes.
I think probably hardly anyone could name very many. Like people could name Samson,
yes,
and maybe a couple other if you're put to the test. But what's the next mention or the next prominent mention about Hazor in Judges? We already talked a little bit, but what happens?
Yes. So according to the internal chronology of Scripture, you've got about 130-year gap between Joshua's conquest and the time in Judges 4 and 5.
Okay.
So this is during the judgeship of Deborah and Barak.
Okay.
And you have the famous account of Jael driving the spike through the head or the temple, depending on how you interpret it, of Sisera, the general of King Jabin's general, right? So you have that whole story. A woman defeats this general. So people are familiar with that. But the biblical text indicates that, the Israelites continued to wage war against Jabin, king of Hazor, until he was defeated. So this is important in the context of what's happening there, because it looks like, even though the text doesn't tell us, it looks like Joshua conquers Hazor, and then over time, it looks like the Canaanites took the city back.
Okay.
But the Bible doesn't tell us how that happened, or if the Israelites didn't guard the city enough, or didn't have the troops to guard it, or they lost a battle there. We just don't know. We simply don't know from the text. The archaeology seems to show a gap of time where the site wasn't occupied, but then the Canaanites got back in there and took control of the city again.
Now,
which is interesting. What happened in there? Well, we don't know.
Well, I don't have Joshua memorized, but wasn't one of the the Lord's commands is to, at least for certain cities, maybe it was all of them, but just wipe out these people and kill them all. Was that? Yes. I don't recall off the top of my head. Was that for Hazor? Was that the command? Yeah,
it was, and you wonder if they were completely obedient with that. You get the impression from the narrative that they did what they were supposed to do. But it was a large city, and again, the Israelites moved on to doing other things. So I'm not sure. I've not always been 100% sure how to interpret that. Is it because of unfaithfulness, or is it just the reality of a military campaign? Mm-hmm. There's an ebb and flow. We took this city, then we lost the city, then we took it back. Mm-hmm. That kind of thing. Really, in a way, I said before, the conquest was 6 years.
Yeah.
At least in terms of the chronology of Joshua. But the Israelites really didn't take the land in its fullness until the time of David.
Yeah. Because David was still fighting, the Philistines.
But there was some, the Jebusites were basically Canaanites who lived in Jerusalem. And so you still had a persistent foreign influence. So they controlled the country, but they didn't control it. Mm-hmm. Maybe an analogy is maybe, it's not an exact analogy, but what happened in the Second Iraq War? There was a major military, the Allies, mainly the United States, right, took the country, took control of it, won the military battle, but the control of Iraq wasn't in the hands, right, of the American troops. There was guerrilla warfare. There was cities that the Iraqis had taken that, we couldn't get them out of, all that kind of thing. So did we win? Yes. And then partly no.
Yeah.
Right. And then in the end, we ended up leaving. That's a whole nother story. But I'm just using the analogy in terms of there's a victory, but it's not like a World War II kind of victory where it's like the enemy surrenders and the country belongs to the conqueror. End of story.
Yeah. It's
more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
So I think we see the same thing in the story from Joshua all the way to David. So,
you wonder, makes me wonder if, when God says, get rid of all these people, kill them, if they would have, seeing as how I know in some situations they didn't, or they tried to make peace with certain peoples and that kinds of stuff. But then they just remained this constant thorn that they had to deal with.
Yes.
And cultural influence, not only that part of it, but just this other people group that you think of it today, Israel and Palestine, it's the same stuff. You have two people groups trying to get along, not trying to get along, whatever. Yep. It's this divided.
Vying for the same territory.
Yeah, everyone has a claim. They want it back. And then even when they argue about it, it's like, well, 1,000 years ago, this happened, and 2,000 years. Well, it's just it's the same arguments.
Yeah.
Kind of the same people, probably the same people groups.
Yeah. It's very interesting. So it's an old story, but not
still going on.
It's still going on. It's still part of what happens. And now in the particular case of Joshua, you're getting to we've talked on our podcast several times about this issue of, killing of people and all that. And we've fleshed that out. We're not going to go into all that today. But the point is, though, I think what part of what you're getting at is, the Lord is the sovereign of all. And when his commands are not obeyed, there's consequences. Mm-hmm. Now, when you think about what's going on there, how does God work in that? Well, he also knows the Israelites aren't going to do fully what they're told, because he says things like, the land is yours. Look, I have given it to you. But then you read the book of Judges and it doesn't look that way. Mm-hmm. But I think there's probably a tension there that's deliberate in the narrative. It's yours, like in the sense of, I don't know, think of when Paul says, if we're going to jump to a New Testament analogy, you are seated in the heavenlies. You've inherited the kingdom of God. Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of days that I wake up, I don't feel like I inherited the kingdom of God. I'm in a battle. So it's like the already not yet, kind of like the victory's won, but it's not over. Mm-hmm. There, when the Lord is saying to the Israelites, at least I think, the land is yours. I have given it to you. Now, I think the condition there is obey my commands, and that'll reach its fruition. And they don't, and it becomes a mess. Mm-hmm. So, some people say that there's a contradiction in the text, but I think if you read that theologically and understand the broader picture of the story, all the way down to David, I think it makes more sense understanding it that way. Mm-hmm. So, I don't know. Hopefully we didn't get off track there too much.
No, we didn't at all. So for the site of Hazor,
yes,
It's enormous. There are kind of, I was looking it up, so there's like an upper city and a lower city kind of deal. Can you talk a little bit about the excavations that have been going on? When did they start in modern times?
Yes.
And who were the people and that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so there was the main excavations that were done in the 1950s were by an archaeologist named Yigal Yadin, who also was a famous military commander.
Okay.
Fought for the Israel in the 6-Day War, I believe, and other battles that took place for their independence and their early history in the 1940s, 1960s, and so on. So Yadin was also an archaeologist. What a life that is, you know.
Mm-hmm.
He's a military general and an archaeologist. So
isn't that sort of like the historian? Wasn't he a military? Josephus, wasn't he a military guy? And
yes.
then he became a historian?
Yeah, see, there you go. There you go. It's a good analogy. I never thought of that before. So Yadin excavated there, found what he believed was evidence that the city had been destroyed.
Now, was it ever in doubt that this site was Hazor?
No,
okay.
No, not that I know of. I don't think anybody's ever disputed that.
Okay.
I mean, there just simply is no other candidate. Kind of like Shiloh, you know. It's been known for forever.
Okay, so that's not controversial.
Yeah, that's the location. The site itself is not under dispute. So Yadin found in the lower city. So you have the upper city, which is like the Coke bottle, which I mentioned, and then the lower city. So he did some excavation in the lower city. He found a temple there, and he determined that this was destroyed by a foreign invader. So and he felt that the temple was targeted.
Okay.
Deliberately. Now, how do you
determine that?
How do you know that? You know, that's an interesting thing because that's an interpretation of the argument. So the temple's destroyed.
Yeah.
Now, is that a consequence of a military battle or is that a deliberate targeting? He felt it was deliberate. There's no reason to take out a temple from a military standpoint. So the inference that he drew was from the biblical narrative.
No, was he a Christian or he was Jewish?
Jewish.
Okay.
Right. It looks like he took the Bible somewhat seriously.
Okay.
You know, I think he dated the conquest in the 13th century, not where we would date it. But the fact that he believes in the conquest is a quasi-conservative position because a lot of people don't believe that at all.
Okay.
I mean, the way that Israeli archaeology has kind of gone today, I mean, Yadin kind of looks like a Bible thumper in retrospect, you know. So that's interesting. I think your question is a good one in terms of you have this temple targeted and you know the Israelites are sort of, you know, looking to get rid of idolatry, you know, in the context of also driving the people out of the land, killing them.
Getting rid of their gods.
Creating a holy realm. But part of creating a holy realm is to get rid of the idols.
Okay, yeah.
There's the one true God and they have all these idols. So there's no really military significance to attacking a religious temple.
Okay.
And that's kind of how Yadin, I think, reasoned from the biblical text. It seems a very reasonable inference. Mm-hmm. But again, you can see how you still have to be careful about making that jump. You don't know what the motivation was of the attackers. Mm-hmm. Unless you're convinced they're Israelites, then you can put more meat on those bones.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. And then one of his students who was mentored by Yadin, Amnon Ben Tur, who became the excavator at Hazor, and then he was the one in charge of it when I was a volunteer in 2007.
So there's been like kind of continuous digging for like 50 years plus.
Yeah, I think there was a gap of time in there, but it's a pretty steady.
Okay.
The city is so large you could excavate it. I mean, Ben Tur said it takes 600 years to excavate Hazor or something like that. Okay. You know, that's an estimate, but I mean, it is enormous. So, you know, he continued that work. Now so let me talk about the two arguments that are made. Yadin found evidence for destruction in the 15th century, which is this temple.
I want to back up a little bit.
Like, sure.
So I did look some stuff up online when I was talking about the temple destruction.
Yes.
Now, were there some statues that were found that had been purposely decapitated, defaced? Can you talk? Do you know about that? Can you talk about that?
Yeah,
because that would be evidence for
of deliberate targeting of religious iconographic material. Exactly. So that's the other thing you are inferring from the biblical text, because you don't know how those statues got smashed,
Okay.
how those idols got decapitated,
Okay.
why the temple was targeted, right? You don't know just from the archaeology.
Mm-hmm.
You can't know that.
Mm-hmm.
It could be all kinds of motivations you come up with. But then when you start looking at the biblical narrative, you see, we got decapitated idols.
Mm-hmm.
We've got smashed Egyptian statues. We've got a temple that's targeted.
And the statues, it looks like it was intentional, not like, it fell over and broke as a part of the burning.
Yeah, it does. It does. But
okay.
To be honest, you have an interpretation, right? How did it get smashed? Could a giant stone have fallen on it and smashed it?
Okay.
But I think what the overall evidence seems to be is that you start sort of adding it up. You start seeing all this religious material being busted up, and then a temple being apparently deliberately destroyed. And you can make those reasonable inferences from that.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say there was a theory that it wasn't the Israelites. They weren't around. The Egyptians did it. The Egyptians launched a campaign into Canaan, and they're the ones that destroyed the city in the 15th century. That's one theory that's been in the academic material.
Mm-hmm.
But then you ask the question, why would Egyptians target Egyptian statues and destroy them? Right? I think that's a reasonable question to ask. If they weren't destroyed by accident, why would Egyptians destroy their own idols, as it were?
Mm-hmm. And especially if they were if Hazor was in some way a city-state under the umbrella of Egypt.
Yeah. I think the other flaw in that theory, and Doug Petrovich has pointed this out in an article that he wrote years ago, and we've published it, republished it on our website, is that, the Egyptians wanted to keep these cities intact for trading purposes. They wanted to control Canaan because they wanted to control the trade route.
Yeah, the money.
So there's no motivation for them to destroy the Canaanite cities.
Mm-hmm.
They were just be shooting themselves in the foot.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? It wasn't meant as like a war of annihilation against the Canaanites, as it was for the Israelites.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a different. It doesn't make sense that they would do that. I mean, I suppose it's possible. You could always say that something is possible.
Mm-hmm.
You're talking about the motivations of men, right? But if you really think about it logically, why would it was Tutmosis III is the pharaoh that has been said to supposedly have destroyed Hazor in the 15th century. And it just the theory just doesn't seem to work very well. Now, he did launch campaigns into Canaan and Syria during this general time frame, a little bit before Joshua, but it just doesn't seem to work. So the back to your original question, the destruction of the religious material is really intriguing for the obvious reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can make a reasonable case, I think. Hey, we have the Israelites, we know their theology, and we have this destroyed religious stuff. You put two and two together, it makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm. So these two archaeologists who excavated over the years, what are some of their other findings with, the Bible says that it was destroyed, set on fire by Joshua.
Yes.
So did they find destruction, evidence of a fire, evidence of...
Yes. Yeah, both of them had found that. Now, it's not extensive.
Okay.
So we have to be, transparent about, like, it's not like what we see at Jericho.
Okay.
But when we dug at our site that we thought was we didn't find a lot of widespread destruction, but because the site had eroded and, there was different factors at Khirbet el-Maqader that kind of destroyed the evidence. But in the case of Hazor, it's so big, there's been a lot of excavation there, but only a small percentage of the site has been excavated. What has been found in the 15th century is some evidence of destruction, enough to say something happened here.
Mm-hmm.
In my view, I think we just need to see more excavation.
Okay.
So it's not extensive, but it's there. Now, then there's another one that both of them have found that's in the 13th century.
Okay.
And that's extensive. And everybody agrees on that the city was destroyed in a violent attack against it in the 13th century.
Okay.
Now, both Ben-Tur and Yadin attributed this to Joshua.
Okay. So they say Joshua was there in the 13th century.
In the 13th century,
Okay.
which would fit what we call the late Exodus conquest theory.
Okay.
We don't think that's right. We think it's earlier.
Okay.
We think that since Deborah and Barak fought against the king of Hazor, that this could be an Israelite destruction of the city. Now, the biblical text in Judges 4 and 5 does not say that they destroyed the city.
Okay. Just says they killed the king or whatever.
They drove them out. They oppressed them further and further, I think is like the literalness of the text, right? So they just kept pressing them until they defeated them. But defeating the king of Hazor could very well imply defeating the city itself.
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily have to. Could it be somebody else? Yeah, maybe. There's always that possibility. The text doesn't demand that Hazor was destroyed in the 13th century.
Mm-hmm. Just because it doesn't say it happened doesn't mean it didn't happen.
That's right. And the fact that it's found in the archaeology is consistent with the narrative. Because that's what you would expect. You would expect them. If you defeat the king of Hazor, you defeat his city. That seems like a reasonable inference.
If you waged a campaign against it and there's lots of fighting, then yeah.
Yeah. It'd be like in World War II, the Russians and the Soviets and the Allies defeated Germany. Well, the inference of that is they destroyed Berlin, which is what happened, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if they defeated Hitler, he was in Berlin. So we had to destroy Berlin, right? So kind of the same idea. I don't know if that analogy works great, but the idea is it fits with the biblical text. And we don't have to say that Deborah and Barak destroyed the city. Could have been somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
But it fits really nicely. And the same phenomenon, the destruction of religious material.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing, much more extensive.
So there was another destruction of temple stuff.
Yeah. So a violent fire in the upper city. Yadin says the total destruction of the city, calls it stratum 13. This is an archaeology term. Think of a layered cake, right? Was evident in all excavated areas, he says, unquote. The end of the stratum came about as a result of a violent fire. So there you go. The fact that they would have lit the city on fire, that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So, it's another one of those archaeological things when you start putting together the little pieces. What I say many times is that matrix of evidence, bit by bit by bit by bit, you put it all together. And the fact that only a small percentage of Hazor has been excavated.
Mm-hmm.
I think, this is just a guess on my part, if people were to continue over the next 50 years to excavate Hazor, we would find more evidence of the 15th century destruction. That wouldn't surprise me.
Mm.
But then again, that's what the biblical text says.
Yeah.
So, we obviously take that as actually happening. So it'd be interesting to see what unfolds in the future with Hazor.
So there's, just to kind of recap, there was evidence, a small amount of evidence for a 15th century burning that these archaeologists found, then massive widespread in the 13th century. They would attribute the 13th century one that was widespread as the destruction of Joshua's time.
Yes.
Because they believe in a later date of when Israelites came out of Egypt and then entered in. So there's two competing. There's ABR holds an early Exodus, early entry to Canaan theory based on all kinds of stuff. So it's not necessarily in dispute that there were two burnings that happened, two destructions.
There's been a couple of scholars recently that have been saying they don't think that there was a destruction in the 15th century.
Okay.
But there's two things that need to happen with that, I think, in order to answer that claim. One is to just sort of go back and look again at what Yadin and Ben Tor both have reported in their reports so far, make sure that it's been interpreted correctly. As far as I understand it, I really don't think that's in dispute. Why people are saying that, I'm not 100% sure. But it does spur us sort of to go back, make sure that we've understood the two archaeologists' arguments correctly, and then kind of see what's been found in recent years. We haven't done an update on this, so we need to do one. I think as a ministry, we're going to try to do that. And this is a good lesson. We were talking before the show about archaeology. It's always changing. You think you have what's a slam dunk, and it can remain a slam dunk, but then sometimes you find evidence later that either augments it or overturns your interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
So you always have to be open to things changing in terms of what you understand about it. But, I've read some of this material and looked at a couple of the reports and looked at some of the pottery. Now I'm not an expert on pottery, but I mean, you can read what the archaeologists are saying and how they're dating the pottery. Mm-hmm. And they're dating it at the time of Joshua and then Judges. So it's not us saying that. It's these archaeologists who have excavated the site. So why people are trying to dispute that, I'm not 100% clear on. I think the direction to keep going is to keep evaluating that, make sure it's been understood right, and then look at the new information as we go forward.
So since this has been an ongoing excavation for decades,
yes,
with maybe some breaks in between, and are they actively still digging there?
Yep. As far as I know, Dr. Bentour, I wanted to retire, and he had a student that was going to take over, and unfortunately, she passed away relatively young. So I don't know if he's going to be passing the torch, but he's getting to be an older man now. So we're hoping that that torch will be passed, because this site is extremely important. I can't imagine that there won't be people motivated in Israel to continue to dig that site, because anybody would have an opportunity to be in charge of it would jump at the chance, I would think, unless they had other commitments that they couldn't get away from. So hopefully it'll continue for a long time.
Mm-hmm. And as that research continues, is ABR doing any other analysis of, since a lot of ABR's research has to do with the conquest period, Joshua period, has in the last few years, or even now, is ABR doing continuing to look at the evidence and, I don't know, not come up with new theories, but has there anything that's been going on recently that?
Yeah, we've been having, that's a great question. We've been having internal conversations about doing some updated research on this. And we got a couple guys, one staff member and another gentleman who just got his degree in archaeology, who want to sort of go back and look at this. And what kind of spurred it is a couple of these claims that the 15th century destruction isn't there.
Okay.
So it's kind of like, wait a minute, why are they saying that? Let's go back and look and make sure that we've got it right.
Okay.
Find out why they're saying that, and then look at the new evidence and see if it just adds to what's already been said in the published reports. So I hope, in the next couple of years, we'll be able to do that. It takes a long time, to sift through all the material, but this is an important component of archaeology, is you're not only publishing about what you're publishing now, but you're always having to
relook at it.
Yeah. And it gives you job security, I suppose.
That makes it sound like there's flexibility within, I'm saying this jokingly, but it's not just, we found it. It's science. Go science. It's done.
Yeah. No, not that's a great point. Yeah. Think about, just go back 100 and some odd years and find a textbook on, blood circulation and how people thought that worked. Or 100 other things about the human body that people thought just over 100 years ago, and most of it would just be thrown in the trash bin, right? Well, archaeology can be a little bit like that. Now, an artifact is an artifact. The artifact doesn't change. But the further evidence that you find can change. New methodologies to examine the evidence certainly changes, especially things like human skeletons, doing DNA analysis, right? We couldn't do that 50 years ago with archaeology. New methods to evaluate evidence. We've been able to take like pottery and send it to a laboratory to have the neutron activation analysis, it's called. Basically, figure out where was the pottery made. Was it bought locally? Was it imported? Like you can kind of figure out, if you have other data, where the pottery was made. Well, 50 years ago, they weren't doing that kind of stuff. So it's interesting. Your question's a good one, because we don't want to sound like it's completely postmodern and we can't say anything true about archaeology.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's not true either. We do know a lot.
It's just ongoing. But
it's ongoing, and we also have to reevaluate, especially interpretation.
Okay.
Over and over again. How do people understand this? Like Yadin, let's go back to Yadin. The fact that he took the biblical text seriously is partly because he was the product of a time when more people did.
Mm-hmm.
If he came out today and did that, there would be people in the academic community in Israel that would be up in arms about that, right? So, well, why is that? Well, that's because the paradigm of how they understand the evidence has shifted. Now, it's shifted in a direction that we think is the wrong direction, so it's shifted further away from the biblical text as being true and being the authority. But the paradigm changes too. So the way the archaeologists look at the bigger picture of how the evidence fits into it also shifts. So it's reevaluating the evidence. Did they make mistakes? Did they misread the pottery? You can, if you read a report from 50 years ago, they didn't know as much about the pottery as they do now because we've discovered millions of more pieces of pottery in Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they didn't have it quite dated right or misidentified something, or more of that item has been found, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm throwing out a lot there. It's so interesting. Again, I'm not going postmodern here, but there is a tentative nature to these things. And that's why the Word of God has to be the foundation that we stand on, because God is speaking. That's certain, as long as we haven't misinterpreted the Bible and misinterpreted the text. Other things change. Some things are on sandy ground and they collapse. Different theories from the past. So all that being said, our objective needs to be continuing to look at the new evidence, but also reevaluating the old. And that takes a lot of work. It takes a long time.
Mm-hmm.
It's not something that can happen. It's multi-generational too.
Yeah.
We're not the first generation here at ABR. We're probably third generation now, if you really want to count it that way. And there's 30 years from now, hopefully God willing, we'll look back at some of the work we've done and say, well, hey, they did great work, but they missed this and they didn't know about this and we found this and they made this mistake, and of course, if we knew what those mistakes were, we would fix them now.
Yeah.
But that's the whole point. So hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, definitely. And then I guess one last question. So just digging at a particular site can be just interesting on its own, learning the history of the site and finding what was there and kind of trying to identify what happened and how does that mix together with a historical narrative. But in today's context, why is continuing to dig at this site of Hazor significant, maybe even with challenging the ideas of did Israel even exist at that time?
Yeah.
That's something I've been learning about more lately is the documentary hypothesis and just these challenging worldviews that say Israel didn't exist or didn't exist at that time. And so
sure.
Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, that's good. Like one of the paradigms to, okay, so if you don't believe in a historical exodus, which most scholars don't believe in, well, that's connected directly to the conquest story, right? They left Egypt, they wandered in the wilderness.
Then they went in.
And then they took the promised land. Mm-hmm. Well, if there's no exodus and there's no wandering, how do you explain the existence of the Israelites? You have to have some other paradigm to explain it. So there's different theories. They were indigenous tribes who rose up against their Canaanite overlords and took over the country internally. And they invented this story about themselves to justify their political power. That's just one theory that's out there. It's in the literature and people believe that that's the case. And then you have what you were onto is the history of the biblical text itself. We probably have mentioned this in previous episodes, but it bears repeating. There's the theory as it relates to Joshua and Judges that this material didn't arise until the time of Josiah, which is 7th century BC. So we're talking 600-700 years
later
after the time that the biblical timeline. So in the mind of the person who holds to that view, the idea that you can find archaeology that's consistent with the narrative is not possible.
Yeah.
Or you're just operating with a paradigm that just doesn't work because the text didn't even come into existence until later. Mm-hmm. So the archaeology can't correlate with it. So what do you do with that? Well, I think the ongoing excavations at a place like Hazor will continue to, I completely believe it'll continue to vindicate the view that, no, Joshua was written contemporaneously.
Mm-hmm.
This is by a witness. Like things like, Rahab lives amongst the Israelites to this day,
Mm-hmm.
right? The specifics of the text, how would somebody in the 7th century know that Hazor was the head of all these kingdoms?
Mm.
How would they know that? In the 7th century, the Israelites have been in control of the land for centuries.
Mm-hmm.
King David, Solomon, right? Hazor wasn't a prominent, it was in existence, and it was destroyed by the Assyrians, but it wasn't the head of all the kingdoms in that time period. How would anybody know that? And you get that impression from the Amarna letters. So the point of all that is the details in the text speak of eyewitness testimony, in my view, close eyewitness account. And the archaeology seems to fit that in a precise way, just like something like the fire, which we talked about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Well, how would somebody know later on, centuries, that the city was burned? Right? How would they possibly know? There's no way they could know that the city was burned with fire. So the continuing, ongoing excavation of a place like Hazor, it'll continue to yield its secrets and treasures and help us to understand the city broadly, and then particularly the eras that relate to the biblical text. So just like every other site, it has its importance. I think in time, the more you accumulate the evidence, the more it'll chip away at the paradigm.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the one thing about that is sometimes we think, I've done this. If we show them enough evidence, we'll be able to convince them the paradigm doesn't work. And maybe some people will be persuaded by that. But the unbelieving mind, the mind of sinful man, is such that once the paradigm doesn't work, they'll just invent a new paradigm. That's unless the Spirit of God is working in their mind to open it, they'll just come up with some other paradigm to try to deny the biblical texts and its reliability and all that. So when that arises, then the church's responsibility will be to deal with that paradigm, whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's until the Lord returns, that's always going to be the case. The Lord will raise up a generation of men and women who will love his word and deal with it in the same way that hopefully that we have. It'll be different arguments. It's the same battle. Did God really say? Genesis 3.
Mm-hmm.
So it's new, but it's the same.
Yeah.
It's the same story over and over again, recapitulated.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, that's my thought on that.
Yeah, that's great.
Hopefully that's helpful.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And also, basically even before today, I'd heard the name Hazor, but I really didn't know much about it. So it was really interesting listening to you kind of lay it all out there and to realize that it's a bigger deal than there's a lot of stuff that happened in the Bible that if you've read it all the way through or haven't, or there's a lot of stories in there that you don't realize how big they are until you kind of investigate a little bit.
That's exactly right. We encourage people, take up and read, as Augustine said, right? Read the Word of God, read these narratives. And the archaeology helps you understand them a little bit better because they are, especially in the Old Testament, there's a foreignness to it.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that it's a dead letter, it's the Word of God, so it's alive, and he's given it, Paul says in Romans 15:4, these things were written for our instruction. So all of this is there for us to be instructed. So it's important. But in terms of the archaeology, it just kind of helps draw out, why is this city important and why is it there? And the Lord is only giving us this little snippet about the city, Hazor, right? He gives us this narrative, a bunch of verses, and then the text moves on. But there's this whole history of the city that you find in the world of archaeology, which we described at the beginning of the program. And it's wow, this really happened in space and time. Here's a real place and a real time. It's not a story. It's not what does they say? They joke as they say, it's not a bathtub arc. The bathtub ark, makes a kid feel like it's just a story that's not real, something they see on TV. No, Hazor, these accounts in the Bible, they happen the way they're described. And this is another example of making that connection cognitively in the mind, especially of a young person. This is not, as much as I love it, this is not Lord of the Rings, right? Yeah. This is not Narnia. And those are great stories. Don't misunderstand me, but they're stories. This is the real story. And the thing I love the most about archaeology is how it draws that out for us. It says, as God was faithful to Joshua, defeat the king of Hazor, the head of all these kingdoms, so he'll be faithful to me to defeat the enemies, the Hazors in my life, spiritually, right? So there's a lot to be drawn out of that.
Well, I hope you guys found that as interesting as I did. I didn't really know much about Hazor. They're still actively doing excavations there. You can check it out at hazor-excavations.org. They've got photos, reports, blog posts, and you can even sign up there if you want to be a part of a future dig. Thanks for listening. Until next time.
Digging for Truth is a presentation of the Associates for Biblical Research. To find out more about ABR, just go to BibleArchaeology.org.